Now we're going to talk about linear periodization. Linear periodization is probably the most well-known and maybe sometimes used, depending on who your client is, type of periodization. And really, the key behind linear periodization is that your volume is going to decrease while your intensity increases. And I'm going to show you a visual here in a moment that will help. It is critical that you understand that relationship with linear periodization. So traditional linear periodization, your intensity is going to increase, and as you increase your intensity, your volume is going to decrease. And this is true for both your cardiovascular endurance athletes as well as your strength-based athletes or clients. Okay, so for this type of periodization, usually you have 1 to 2 competitions per year, so you have basically 1 to 2 peaks per year, and then you have these 3 to 4 month phases. Each phase emphasizes a physiological adaptation. So this is where those different components come into play. So if you have 3 to 4 month phases, you might have 3 to 4 months of endurance-based programming. You might have 3 to 4 months of hypertrophy-based programming. You might have 3 to 4 months of strength-based programming, and then 3 to 4 months of power. And again, all of this depends on your client, what they're training for, and when their when their event actually is. Linear periodization may not be appropriate for endurance or general populations. It really kind of just depends on what they're training for. If your endurance athlete has, they only have 2 competitions a year, then it's probably fine. But if you're working with an athlete who is, they run marathons for a living, because that's a thing, right? If you're working with an athlete who does that, if they're doing a marathon a month or even a marathon every 6 weeks, that's not going to lend itself to this kind of traditional linear periodization just because it won't fit within the traditional model and the time frame of linear periodization. And then same thing for the general population. Most people, if they're just kind of training for life, they don't necessarily need these kind of chunks in very specific blocks. And in many cases, if they're not leading up to an event to train for, it's kind of purposeless, right? It's not going to be useful for them. And there's other types of periodization that's probably better for that general population. Classic is superior for increasing maximal strength, so we know that linear periodization has been shown to increase maximal strength amounts, and that longer training periods are needed to see benefits. And that's why sometimes it's not best for general population and or endurance-based athletes who are having multiple events in a year. So high intensity volume, or high initial volume, and then low intensity. That's key, right? So let me show you this visual that will help you. What you kind of see on that x-axis is the change in time, and then on the y-axis you have volume and intensity, and as well as skill. But the 2 things I really want you to pay attention to are volume and intensity. And you can see that regardless of which terminology you're using, whether it's European, American, traditional and or American power strength, everyone has their own terminologies. Regardless of which one you're looking at, the trend is the same. So you see as time goes by with this linear-based model, you see an increase in intensity, and then you see a decrease in volume, and that it peaks during that competition phase. Okay? Super important that you understand that that's kind of what happens in this linear-based model. And here's another visual, if you kind of need another visual here. What you have in green are your microcycles. In blue, those numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 are your mesocycles, okay? And then in the black kind of gray circle is your macrocycle, and that's anywhere from 1 to 4 years. Again, knowing that we have these 4 different components that go into it, right? Endurance, hypertrophy training, strength training, and power training. And so this is an example of different resistance training that would go within this kind of classic linear model that you would use for a client. So now I want you to pause and think about, well, what about athletes that compete multiple times a year? And we kind of talked about this already, right? Well, what do you do? How can you train them? Always remember that your periodization is made up of these macrocycles, mesocycles, microcycles, and then individual sessions. So depending on your client, you need to ask them first and foremost, how many times do you plan on competing in this year? And if you can make linear periodization work for them, awesome. Okay, if you can't, then consider potentially another training model, whether it be reverse linear or even potentially undulated training. So reverse linear periodization is exactly the same thing as linear periodization, except for you're switching what you do with volume and intensity. So essentially what you do is you see your training intensity decrease while your volume increases. If you remember, this is exact opposite of your traditional linear periodization. So all you need to remember is what traditional linear periodization is, and then if you remember that, if you think about reverse linear, it's the exact opposite. Okay, so volume is going to increase in reverse linear periodization as your intensity decreases. It's following the same rules as far as the macrocycle, the mesocycle, the microcycle, and then the individual sessions. Okay, so all that changes is how you go about utilizing volume and intensity. Now let's discuss undulated periodization. Undulated periodization is probably the form of periodization that you yourself have been using and really didn't know it. Okay, it's also known as nonlinear periodization because it doesn't follow a linear pattern. So if you remember, both linear and reverse linear kind of had this relationship between intensity and volume. As one went up, the other one went down. It was pretty linear. Undulated periodization is not linear, and I'll show you a visual here in a moment that will help. Okay, comparatively, we have shorter intervals that are made up of this type of programming, so it's not as long of chunks as you tend to see in linear and reverse linear periodization. In undulated training or undulated periodization, what you see is this frequent changing in stimulus and type. So you're constantly essentially trying to change what your training type is so that your body doesn't get used to it. So because of this, you're limiting your chance for plateaus. This is what most personal trainers will use with their kind of everyday client, because most everyday clients aren't trying to train for a specific event. They are training for a feeling, or to lose weight, or to look a certain way, or to feel good, or to drop their blood pressure, whatever it may be, right? So because there's no specific event tailored to this, undulated periodization is really usually a good option, because if you're only seeing your client 2 times a week or even 3 times a week, this is a good method to make sure that they're getting the best or most out of their training. Because of the nature of undulated periodization, you are constantly going to change and adapt what you're using and giving to your client. This is really kind of nice for many of your clients because it adds variety and sometimes can help with adherence because it's less boring, right? There's always something new and different that they're doing, and so that can kind of make people excited to come to training because it is new and different, right? And sometimes a little bit more challenging. So we know that undulated periodization has been shown to be superior than other periodizations because it does help reduce neural fatigue. So what happens with linear and reverse linear is that as they constantly increase their intensity or volume, whichever one you're looking at, that neural fatigue is going to set in. Okay, and so a lot of general population people won't want to use that. So that's a reason why it's superior. We also know that sustained training adaptations for all aspects of training year-round. So athletes retain coordination for explosive exercises. Athletes retain muscle hypertrophy. And so these are all, again, reasons why undulated periodization is probably one of the better protocols if you're just working with the average Joe or Jane client. Here's a nice visual again for you, all you folks who like visuals. So you can basically see that we still have these 4 different training components that go into it, right? So you still have endurance, you still have strength, power, and hypertrophy, but now it's not built into those mesocycles and microcycles, right? It's built, actually, you can change it by week. You can actually, for your time frame for your undulated periodization, you could change it by day. You can change it within the session itself. So you could do a few lifts that are endurance-based, and then you can do a few lifts that are strength-based. You can do some cardiovascular programming that's more hypertrophy-based, and you can do some cardiovascular training that's more strength-based. Okay, so thinking about how we can incorporate this in our training and how maybe potentially you already do is an important thing. Here's an example of a nonlinear or undulated periodization. Again, the most important thing that you can see here is that there's really no rhyme or reason, right? There's no kind of linear format, which is why it's non-linear. So your intensity on Monday is 8 to 10, and then on Wednesday it's 4 to 6, and on Friday it's 13 to 15, right? So there's no clear relationship between intensity and sets and rest, and that's what makes it that undulated periodization. Again, no chance for plateaus. Always allows you to adapt, okay, which is really helpful for that kind of mind-body piece of it and helps your clients sustain and want to be there with you. So a quick learning recap, I want you to be able to list and describe the 3 different types of periodization models. This is critical that you know the difference between the 3 and that you'll be able to utilize any of those in your actual programming in the future.